You're listening to the ESO Network, your station for all things geek.
Hello, music lovers, and welcome to Modern Musicology. We are glad to have you aboard. My name is Alan, and with me is Rob Levy.
Hey, what's up?
Anthony Williams.
Howdy.
And Stephanie Seymour.
Hi, people.
Tonight, we are doing another one of our anniversary shows. We are talking about the amazing year 1988 and the incredible albums that came out that year. We're going to be doing this as a two-parter, just like we did 1983, because holy cow, there's so much stuff to talk about. So we're going to be getting to all of that. We're going to do half the year for this episode. Before we jump into that, though, I just have a couple of little things to talk about in listener feedback. The first one is about our Wham episode when we reviewed the Wham documentary. Sharon Conn Campbell says, quote, "Amazing how little of an ego Andrew had. He obviously recognized his best mate's incredible talent and knew that in order for George to truly soar, he had to step aside. He seemed to appreciate experiencing the 4-year meteoric rise of Wham with his best mate, but he knew he couldn't take the project further. To be this humble and aware at 23 years old is even more astounding. What a special human."
That's my buddy Sharon.
Oh, yeah?
Yep.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, and I
Yeah.
think that was kind of the consensus of all of us when we talked about that documentary, is that really opened our eyes to a lot about Andrew. The second thing I've got is from our good friend Bill Lamond, and he decided to email us with his, he has an idea about desert island discs. So here's what he has to say. "Just a quick note about my own ideas of desert island discs. Being on a desert island with no company, I wouldn't want to be reminded of my isolation, so I would want to continue a childhood theme back when I was fairly isolated at home, when I was something of an only child, until my first brother was born when I was 4.5 years old. I love music enough, but for the last 24 years, my remedy for keeping my clinical depression at bay has been I could be listening to something funny instead. So I go back to when I was a little kid before we had a TV, which wasn't until I was about 7 or 8 years old. My dad had brought back a Telefunken tube stereo from Germany when he was in the U.S. Air Force. So he lists 3 discs. The first one, he says, among the LPs that we had were Stan Freberg's United States of America, which is primarily a very funny musical look at U.S. history from early colony days through the Revolution. Number 2, decades later, I learned that Freberg had created a sequel album. And number 3, also from my childhood, is a disc by Danish musician and comedian Victor Borge about anthropomorphic musical instruments getting together to make music. That's all. Got to get back to Saturday decluttering. Thanks for always being good company and helping me get through my otherwise way too boring job. Well, Bill, thank you so much for emailing, and we will always try to be good company for you and for all of our other listeners. And that reminds me that last year you mentioned something about novelty records, and we said that we had been thinking about doing a show about novelty records and that we would add it to the schedule, and we never did. So I'm going to put it on the schedule, and we're going to get that episode for you as quickly as we can. We've got a few things already on the schedule coming up for like the next month or so, but we're going to get to that as soon as we can. So I promise you a novelty records episode soon.
Woohoo.
Woohoo. All right. Let's jump into the year 1988. What a year. Who wants to start us off with just talking about the year in general, just like general impressions of kind of the things that were going on that year?
I will.
Okay, do it.
I mean, for me, this was a year of so much diversity. It was kind of like 83 in that way, where just, everything, there was so many things going on. But I feel like this was hip hop at its finest. There's a, a lot of records I'm going to be talking about are hip hop albums that came out this year. I mean, there was amazing albums from like BDP, Salt and Pepper, Eric B and Rakim, Salt and Pepper, I should say. And
Right.
but I'm going to focus on other albums by like Public Enemy and Stetsasonic. But they called it when you look it up in Wikipedia, all these albums are called the genre is the golden age of hip hop, and really they ain't kidding. It is the best year, I think, for hip hop albums. Well, it's my favorite year, at least, for the releases. And at this time, I mean, I was working at Island Records, and we also had subsidiary hip hop labels like Fourth and Broadway and Delicious Vinyl, and there's just so much going on. And there was an awesome scene, like an awesome New York club scene, Hotel Amazon, Payday, where you would just go and hear all the new up and coming sounds and music. It was really just like the place to be. So I feel like it was a good focus on that. But I was also working at, like I said, at Island, and we had some massive albums this year from like U2, Rattle and Hum, the Pogues, Melissa Etheridge debut, Anthrax, Tom Waits, Julian Cope. I mean, it was just a really amazing, diverse, and fun year, and a great time in my life.
And Stephanie, you noted it as being part of the golden age of hip hop. I think it's also notable in that, from a metal perspective, all four of the big four of thrash put out albums. And then you also have two of what's, in my opinion, are some of the greatest progressive metal albums in Maiden's Seventh Son and Queensryche's Operation Mindcrime. And we'll come back to those later.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Agreed.
Yeah, and it's interesting, too, because you also have kind of growing with the thrash metal thing is the industrial music scene that would end up bleeding into the 90s, because you've got two Frontline Assembly records. You've got the first KMFDM record. You've got a Ministry record and Skinny Puppy.
Yeah.
So you're starting to get that type of stuff coming along as well. And it's also the very beginning of what would be the Summer of Love with the Hacienda and the Manchester stuff. You're getting a couple of those records coming to set up for that. So it really is setting up this amazing melting pot for American music, for music that are coming over here and getting played. And it's also, I also think, the golden age of college radio.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Just because the next 3 years before commercial alternative radio broke, there's just so many great records that are getting played, and college radio is kind of at the forefront of all that.
And this might be the year before we met, Rob, but this is how we met. I was promoting records to college radio, and you were...
No, I was just about to say, this is the year we met.
Yeah.
Because you got me on the guest list for the Pogues.
Oh, the Pogues, yeah.
And then you sent me a vinyl copy of Rattle and Hum with a note on it that says, "I promise it's not all terrible."
I did, because I love this record, and I'm going to talk about it.
No, because because we talked about the movie, and I was talking about just how Bono's ego was just going.
Since you two met this year, I'm going to make you both feel old.
You were born.
I was born in the middle of November 1987, and so come January 88, I was a month and a half.
And that's when you heard "And Justice for All."
I don't think "And Justice for All" came out till later in the year, so maybe I was a year old when I heard it, Rob.
Okay. It's the first thing came to my head.
And the first thing I did at that age was complain that the bass was mixed too low.
Right. Already he had that connoisseur
First words
ear.
out of my mouth.
I think that even more than 83, 88 is a year that's like nothing but identity crisis. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean that there isn't like a particular style or genre that you can really pin down as being sort of like iconic for that year. I feel like everything is going on, and with it coming so late in the decade, you're at a point where all the things that are going to be notable in the 90s are starting to happen. So you it's sort of like a transitional year, not like 89 is going to be, but I think that it's, you see it's on the cusp of that big transition into a lot of the things that's going to happen in the 90s. So
And that's a good point. Like even within genres, there was so
Right.
much diversity. So that's something I was going to talk about too in hip hop.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to start us off. We are recording this on July 30th, and just a couple of days ago, we got the news that Sinead O'Connor had passed away, very sadly. And I know that that's, a little bit off topic for us because her first album came out in 1987, but it came out right at the end of 87. So pretty much all of the radio traffic and the video play that she got was primarily in 1988. And I feel like she's such a presence in 1988 that I want to start us off by talking a little bit about her and about that first album, which came out toward the end of November of 87, Lion and the Cobra. What a phenomenal album. So who wants to kick us off?
Mandinka kind of was the lead single, 87, late 87-ish. It comes on, the first time I heard or saw it was on 120 Minutes. And you're like, who is this? What is this? The body does not match the voice, which I thought instantly was fantastic. Then I was like, okay, I like this. This is kind of cool. I'm down with it. She released a 12-inch, I think in March, for I Want Your Hands on Me, that she had MC Light do an interstitial rap break on. And at that point, I'm like, okay, wait a minute, what's going on? Because then she's getting club play, right? That I Want Your Hands on Me was like breaking in clubs. And from that point on, it took off. I just remember being struck by the presence and the voice because they weren't necessarily matched in the way that you would think. I also was very happy to have a female vocalist who was intelligent and articulate, and it was also very kind of a mystery too, because you still didn't really know what she was about and who she was and things like that, right? She didn't do a ton of interviews still. She was not really a press person, and she still looked, even till the end of 88, really uncomfortable talking to media. That's kind of my first impressions of it, and that first record is just a table set, kind of, I think.
She was and around the New York scene at hanging out and playing, and I think even maybe working at Sinead, which is where I was playing a lot at that time, playing a lot of music and stuff. But I didn't really ever know her or know, it's funny because when she really broke with this first album, or well, when I saw Mandinka, like you said, Rob, probably on 120 Minutes, I was just blown away. I also felt the same thing about the voice. And you look at that beautiful angelic face, and then this fierce, passionate voice came out of her. I feel like one thing about her that I just want to say is I feel like you could always feel her pain. It's just something that just emanated out of her, and it was sad, but it was also really powerful. And she had pain and anger, and she wasn't really afraid to let anybody see that.
Mm-hmm. I think that Mandinka was also my first exposure to her from 120 Minutes, and I immediately loved it. I was working at the record store at the time, Specs Music, in Winter Haven, Florida. I had access to hear whatever I wanted to hear, and I was curious about this album, so I cracked it open, and I just fell in love with it. I mean, it is a remarkable piece of music. In addition to Mandinka, there's Jerusalem, which I think is amazing. Drink Before the War. Rob, you mentioned I Want Your Hands on Me, which, if I remember rightly, got used in the upcoming Freddy Krueger movie, Nightmare on Elm Street.
Oh, really?
Oh, wow.
But I think that the masterpiece on that album is Troy. Oh my God, just such an amazing and powerful song. So I mean, that's we're very sorry to have seen Sinead. I mean, she just had a troubled life, just went through so much shit and
caught such shit for speaking the truth. And all the things she said were true, and yet she was labeled crazy, and she paid such a price for that.
Right.
It was just a supreme injustice.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the whole world owes her an apology. And one of the things we learned very quickly with her is that stereotypes and labeling in music don't work, because up until this time, they could easily put a lot of alternative artists in a box or check a box.
Yeah.
And her crossover appeal is pretty phenomenal, right? There is a track she made on with Terry Hall from the Specials called All Kinds of Everything, right? And one of the things I really like about it is when you see the video for it, she's smiling and she's kind of giggling. And there's a couple times when you see some of her other collaboration stuff, like when she's with Massive Attack and stuff, you just kind of see this like smiling sort of like warmth coming out of her that is like, it's kind of jarring because you're not used to seeing it.
Mhm.
But like when you watch the video for the Terry Hall thing, she's actually like, got like a really coy smile, and at one point there's like a full-on laugh, and it's like, oh wow.
Yeah.
So I like to think of her as having that sense of laughter. I remember the two times I saw her, because I saw her in a small club and then I saw her on Lollapalooza. And when I saw her at Lollapalooza, there was some issue with technical stuff, and I remember she was talking to the sound people trying to fix it, and she made a joke, and I heard her laugh, and it was like, but I remember that a bunch of us who were sitting there were kind of like, wait a minute, did she just laugh? I mean, because she had that persona that was so
Intense.
ingrained.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with being an intense performer. I think it's great, but I think that she had a label that didn't know how to handle it. At the time, I remember the college radio people just didn't know how to work the record. They just weren't sure what to do with it. And it wasn't really until Nothing Compares to You that they kind of got on board the train. Chrysalis just didn't really know how to work this. And I think they put the record out thinking this is going to sell a small amount of units or whatever. And then it just took off. Like the critics loved it. And I think from there, it was just kind of like, we don't know what to do. And then the media didn't know what to do with her. You look at some of the other female artists at the time, she's not Madonna. She's not the woman from Transvision Vamp who's flaunting everything.
Wendy James. Yeah.
Wendy James. Yeah. So she is, by contrast to the women of the time, a punch in the face, so to speak. Right. It's awesome. And she's very punk rock, in a way that's not punk rock, but
Totally.
she kind of took everything from, that sort of Dublin gritty street back environment and put it into her music. And I don't think we give her credit for being a lyricist. I know we talked about the voice, but like you listen to like Three Babies or I'm Stretched on Your Grave or Troy or even Jerusalem, right? Or later on, Famine, you just don't really realize just how great of a lyricist she is until you read it. It's really interesting what a great lyricist she is. And her version of Silent Night that she does is one of the few holiday album song things that gives me chills, because it's just her with like very low modulation behind her, and it's mostly the voice, and it is eerie and it's amazing at the same time.
All right, well, let's just jump into 1988 proper. Who's got something from January that they want to throw at us?
I have something from right at the beginning of January. So January 4th, Marillion released a compilation of their B-sides, Besides Themselves, which is fantastic. They had some very, very strong B-sides early on in their career. And so while none of this was new music, a lot of it was the first time it was available on compact disc.
Yep.
Even today, as they've done their remasters of their studio albums, they still haven't done anything with these B-sides. So this is one of the few places you can get them, and you can kind of get them as non-remastered tracks on kind of the DVDs that come with their remastered albums. But they're fantastic. They're a lot of fun. Whether it's Grendel, which the band kind of roll their eyes at today, Three Boats Down from the Candy, which I think is a fantastic track, Cinderella Search, which has an amazing last minute and a half that rocks really hard, and my personal favorite is Tucson, which was the last B-side they did with Fish before he left the band. It's just such a great little compilation, and kind of a nice way for them to end the era with their first singer.
Rob, I know you want to talk about the Pogues.
No, I've got a couple for this month, but
well, but I just want to say that I think this is how we basically met with right. I sent this album to you, and this might have been the first one.
I was only the assistant music director.
Okay,
then. I wasn't important yet.
Well, you were important to me, but
I just remember really wanting to go to the show.
Yeah.
And not really knowing what to expect. And then just being absolutely floored. The venue they played here had probably more square foot space than members of the band.
Because there was a lot.
It was also the first time I'd seen bands drink, but my God.
Oh my
I've
God.
never seen a band drink, except maybe the Replacements. I've never seen a band drink that much on stage in my life. It's pretty amazing.
So this was a great album. It's called "If I Should Fall from Grace with God," and I just have to say that this was the only album that I got to the #1 position of the CMJ charts, and when I was at Island, it was one of my greater achievements, I think. But this was such a wonderful album, and Fairy Tale of New York. I think that's probably obviously this album is known for Fairy Tale of New York, but there are so many good songs on it, and it's just
it does a lot. Thousands Are Sailing encapsulates the Irish American immigration experience. You've got Fiesta, which is great. You've got If I Should Fall from Grace with God, the title track. You've got Bottles of Smoke. I think you've got Broad Majestic Shannon on that one.
No.
I'll have to check. I don't know. Maybe not.
Oh no, you're right. Yes, it's it. Yep. Yeah. You're right.
And it's just it's pretty relentless too. I mean, for never really hearing at that point in my life a lot of Irish music that wasn't a little less hard and in your face.
Yeah, they were very brash.
I mean, we didn't have the Dropkick Murphys then,
and
you didn't have the 5 other bands that sound like them all around. You had just them.
Yeah.
And it was a novelty. They play Irish punk music.
Good times.
Pretty incredible. Yeah. And the first time you play the record, you're like, okay, there's a lot of songs on here to work with. So different DJs who like different types of music could all find something they like.
Yeah. What else do you have for January?
So I have one that probably I care about more than most people. You have the very first Creation Records version of The House of Love, The House of Love. They named every album pretty much The House of Love, which is amazingly annoying. But the one that they did for Creation, it's got Christine on it and Happy and some other things on it. It's just from start to finish a really good, well-produced record. Christine also really broke over here because of 120 minutes. But that record really took off. Their first 2 or 3 albums were really, really.
You say I don't care about them, but you do. Do you know that we played with them and actually Chris put our Aquanetta's albums out, our singles out over in the UK on his label.
See, I thought you toured with them, but I wasn't sure about anything else.
We played with them a few times over there, but yeah, we were on Chris had a label called Plastic Records, and he put some Aquanetta singles out in the UK for us.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, there you go.
They were great. They were great.
But they're one of those bands that, and sort of the precursors of Britpop, kind of in a way. And then also Galaxy 500 today, which really took off Rough Trade Records in America as a label and really put Dean Wareham on the map as being a songwriter. And the guy kind of on this record at times sounds like Kermit the Frog, but the melodies and the strings, it's very hauntingly beautiful. Like it's a really, really sublime debut record. So I just want to throw that in too.
Then I guess that's going to bring us into February, and I've got a couple of things that are kind of notable in February. The first one is Ace Frehley had left Kiss quite a few years earlier and was doing his own thing now under the name Frehley's Comet. They put out their second album. It was a sort of an EP. It was called Live Plus One, and it was 4 live tracks from their first tour plus 1 new studio track. And that new studio track was fantastic. It's probably my favorite Frehley's Comet song. And later on in the year, I think in May, they put out their second album, and by that point Ace was so trashed and so strung out that he like barely could make it to the studio. So their rhythm guitar player and secondary lead singer, Todd Howarth, took more of the front line and was really carrying the load on that album. So it's called Fraley's Comet, but it's really Howarth's Comet.
Oh,
And
wow.
I just think it's so interesting to watch his deterioration at this point, where he's just so buried under his own addictions that he can't even function enough to record his second album.
Wow, I
So
didn't
yeah,
know
that's
that.
crazy.
Ooh.
The other thing, this is a really interesting story. Toward the end of February, there's this new band, and they were kept very secret. Nobody would say who they were, who the members were. They just put the song out, and they let fans and radio stations speculate. And for, I don't know, a month or more, they were playing this song, and it had a very Led Zeppelin-y vibe to it. And the listeners went absolutely ballistic, thinking, holy cow, this is a reformed Led Zeppelin. This is a new Led Zeppelin song. This is like Led Zeppelin is making a new project or something. And it ended up being a band called Kingdom Come. Had
Yes.
zero to do with Led Zeppelin, other than the singer kind of had that Robert Plant kind of quality to his voice, and they had sort of that dark edge to their music. I loved that first album.
I did
And
too.
it was so good. And I wasn't disappointed that they weren't Led Zeppelin, because it was still a great album. Now, building up that mystique and then not having it deliver on what everyone expected it was going to deliver on killed it. Just killed it. And they did a second album and maybe a third, and nobody gave a damn. So that was just the worst possible thing. But if Wikipedia is to be believed, on the same day, February 29th, Robert Plant put out his new solo album, Now and Then, which is the one where he sort of openly embraced his Led Zeppelin past for the first time, because he had done three solo albums up to that point. No reference to Led Zeppelin. He didn't play Led Zeppelin songs in his tours, nothing like that. The new album, Now and Then, not only used Led Zeppelin song samples in one track that became one of the big singles off of it, but when he toured, he did 4 or 5 Led Zeppelin tunes in his show, and that was like a huge, huge surprise, because he had really shied away from being sort of anchored down to his legacy.
I remember when that record came out, and I at first I don't know, I wasn't like so blown away, but then it grew on me, and I really appreciated it, and I thought it was I really got into it after a while.
It's my favorite of his solo albums. Yeah. I love it. I think it's fantastic. It's a little overproduced. It's kind of got a sheen to it that it doesn't need to have, but I think the material is excellent.
Going back to what you were saying about Kingdom Come, Alan, I think it's interesting that 30 years later, we would have the exact same thing happen again with Greta Van Fleet.
Right.
Right. And that was, I think they showed up about 2017, 2018. So it was literally about 30 years after this.
Yeah, that's right. That is interesting.
I have the Church and Starfish.
Oh, yeah.
Hey.
Which I know Steph loves too.
Yes. Kind of do.
Kind of.
Just a little bit, yeah. It was funny because, I remember we were all bowled over because it came out on Arista, and we never got records from Arista that we could actually play on the radio. It was always terrible, unless it was the Eurythmics. But Starfish is fantastic. I mean, it still holds up. Reptile, those guitar riffs on Reptile are fantastic. I think Reptile is a better song than Under the Milky Way, but Under the Milky Way is the one that sort of
that was a
got
big one, yeah.
Radio written all over it. It's a really interesting album in terms of the songs that are written, the track order. I don't know, Steph, was the heroin addiction during or after this?
Oh gosh, I don't know.
Because if it was, it's one of the best records ever made on heroin.
Yeah.
And I mean that nicely.
It was probably after, because they didn't have enough money to afford heroin until after Milky Way.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's like their 400th album. I mean, they put out a ton of records before this, but this is the one where they sort of just went for it, right?
Yeah.
And it's really, really solid. And it's what, 35 years later, and it still sounds like it came out
There's such
year.
beautiful guitar work on that album, Marty.
Yeah.
He's really great. Yeah, it's just it is really great.
Yeah.
My previous band, Hyperdrive, which is like 10, 15, whatever years ago, used to play Milky Way. We played a very different arrangement of it. We really changed the arrangement of it a lot, but oh my gosh, I loved playing it so much.
That's cool.
Yeah.
All right, March.
Yeah.
March.
I want to give a sort of a shout out to the Pixies for their
Heck
debut.
yeah.
Hell
Yeah.
yes. I mean, what a debut album, right? Surfer
Right.
Rosa.
Yeah.
And also on such a cool label, 4AD. I mean, 4AD was so dope at this time. It really was. Steve Albini produced this album. Gigantic was a single, and it just, wow, this was like a real new sound.
Yeah.
I think this was a new sound.
I
It was a
kind
new
of
sound.
I kind of
Yeah.
agree with that. I think it has definite throwbacks to early punk. You know,
Yes.
they sort of have that
Yes.
punk attitude, and they have that punk, like, we don't give a shit about learning how to play guitars and how to write songs and stuff. We just do what we do. But what I think is interesting is that there are sort of interesting arrangement choices, and the songwriting I think is really good. They just make it
lyrics.
sound like they don't care about that stuff, even though they clearly do, you know. And I
Yes.
think
Yeah.
it's such a
Yes.
neat album.
Because Black Francis is such a good songwriter. He's
Mhm.
he's a really interesting lyricist, and I think that the styles of, like, I just wanted to say Kelly Deal, but it's Kim Deal, Kim, and just the way they all worked together was pretty cool.
Yeah.
The other interesting thing that this record did is, because it's on 4AD, it really sort of revolutionized artwork for albums too. I mean, they sort of had this like way of doing their art that even on the singles and subsequent albums, that was different than everybody else. So you knew, even if you never heard a note, there was a Pixies record.
Yeah.
And I love how they took Husker Du and put him together with the Beach Boys and the Monkees.
That's a neat
And sort of made
comparison.
this like really interesting sound, and it's all over the place. I know we kind of talked about this, but there's like the stuff that's really slow. It's slow and kind of got this like head bopping thing, and then there's the really aggro stuff on it, right?
Yeah.
It's just it's not a record you can put your finger on, which is fantastic.
Yeah. I somehow missed the Pixies train when it left the station. It was years later before I even heard the name the Pixies. And when I did, I was like, how did I not come across this at the time? Because, as I said, I was working at a record store at the time, and I saw everything, and I don't know how I did not come across the Pixies. So,
Yeah.
but once I discovered them, I was like, dude. And then years later, in 2000, I think it was, Bowie covered one of these songs, Cactus. Great,
know that.
great cover.
Yeah.
And then they were, of course, on his 50th birthday concert that he did at Madison Square Garden, which I hope that they release on DVD at some point, because that was a phenomenal show. But yeah, so Pixies, definitely. Also in March was Talking Heads with Naked, which has maybe not but one of my absolute favorite Talking Heads songs, Nothing But Flowers.
Yeah, it's great.
God, I love that song so much. I think it's one of the cleverest lyrics that he ever wrote.
Yeah, you listen to that, and it's such a shame they broke up, because they really were just kind of in a different headspace on that record that really could have been interesting had they continued on.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's pretty great.
What else for March?
So I have two records from two guys that left bands. We'll take the good and then the weird. So first is Peter Murphy's Love Hysteria, which, he left Bauhaus and he did Dolly's Car, and he put out a solo record ahead of time and some stuff. But Love Hysteria really took off. Part of it too is that, you kind of had some of that goth music stuff was taking off on radio over here a little bit. Also, 120 Minutes helped him a lot. But you've got All Night Long on there, which really takes off a lot. And then you've got some other things on there too that I'm blanking on all of the singles now from it. But it really sort of was an album that built up to the commercial success we got later with Cut You Up and some of the other stuff. It really, but it's really an artist that kind of made a solo record that he wanted to make. And it flows really well as an album. The writing's interesting, and it's dark, but it's not like too dark. It's very shadowy. And then I will say that despite what we think about said person now, the first two Morrissey solo singles, Suede Head and Every Day's Like Sunday, were fantastic. After that, I'm not sure what the hell happened. But Viva Hate is an album that's got a lot of great singles on it with a lot of self-indulgence and a lot of stuff on there that's like there's some interesting bits and pieces on it. I don't know if you look at it and go, wow, this is a great record, but the B-sides on that are great because you've got Hairdresser on Fire.
Yeah, that's right.
Which is still you just say that. It's just fantastic. Right? But like Suede Head, the video was on 120 minutes and it broke into regular rotation for about a week. And they were playing that in clubs. I remember going to a club and they put on Suede Head. I'm like, what? And then Every Day's Like Sunday was just so depressingly beautiful. He finally really made melancholy work.
Let's move into April, and I want to kick this one off. There are 4 albums that came out on April 5th. It's from 4 Black artists of very completely different styles, and all of them were either already or were just becoming or were about to become huge stars. So I want to talk about those 4 really quickly. The first one is DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince. The album was called, this is their second album, He's the DJ, I'm the Rapper. And the big hit on that was Parents Just Don't Understand. But they also had Nightmare on My Street, which was one of the themes for that upcoming Freddy Krueger movie. This was the first double album ever in hip hop. And it went like triple platinum or some nonsense. I mean, it was enormous. Other than that, we had Ziggy Marley with Conscious Party. The first single off of it was Tomorrow People. I loved that song so much. And I played that.
People,
God, I love it. And I played that album at the record store all the time. And it's such a good album.
It's a great album.
After that is Sade with their third album, Stronger Than Pride. And I say they because Sade is the name of the band. Sade Adu is their singer, but Sade is the name of the band. Stronger Than Pride, a fantastic album. And the thing that I love about Sade so much is that they had very consistent chart success in America without ever compromising their sound, without ever chasing a trend, without ever, doing what's popular in America at that time. They just did their thing and never swayed from it. And they always were successful. And I love it. But I think the big one, the most important one from that day is the debut album by Tracy Chapman.
Yep.
What a phenomenal record. This record blew me away. I was just floored by it. And what's interesting is that you have this strong, raw, uncompromising social commentary. You have it from a number of rap artists that are coming out this year, and you get it from Tracy Chapman.
Like a folky kind of...
it's this uncompromising look at what inner city life is like. And it's just unbelievably good. And I mean, there's moments of absolute poetry on this album.
Yeah.
Yeah. And her voice is just beautiful.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how April starts out. I mean, where do you go from there?
Yeah. Well,
they took the success of Madness Our House and put all of the top 10, bunch of the top 10 Madness singles and put them all under one record called Madness. And they released it in America pretty much to capitalize on the success of Our House. And that sort of put Madness on the map over here, even though they didn't necessarily commercially take off, but that sort of got them on a lot of radars and really got them rooted beyond their sort of core group of people that had heard of them already. It's also the month we got our first sound of Bjork, right? Because the first Sugar Cubes record came out.
That's one of the main ones I was going to talk. That's huge. Yeah. That album is unbelievable. Life's Too Good. Well, that's a debut also, right? That their debut album. And they have so many good songs on that album.
Mm-hmm.
Birthday, Delicious Demon, Motor Crash Days. So I saw her at the Ritz, and it was like unlike anything I had ever seen. This little fairy-like person with this ferocious voice. I mean, her voice could go from like a whisper to a growl in an instant. You know, it was like a beautiful kind of explosion. I think this was a spectacular debut.
And you didn't really know what to make of it, because it's like, Iceland. What is Iceland? Where is Iceland?
And her lyrics are just what's the right word? I mean, they're very esoteric.
Yes.
They're esoteric.
That's a nice way to say it.
And they're just it was pretty obvious pretty early on that she was kooky.
Yeah.
Kooky. But that record's great. I also should mention too that that's the month that Erasure released The Innocents, which is their sort of big commercial breakthrough record. Because you got Little Respect and I think Chains of Love on that. And they broke, which was a pretty big deal at the time. I think you couldn't go anywhere that spring without hearing A Little Respect on the radio, like in the stores or wherever. Everywhere you went, you heard that for like 2 or 3 months in the summer.
Also in this month, Jane Wiedlin had her second album, Fur.
Yes, that was on my list too.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Rush Hour. I mean, that was big for her. It was like number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100.
Right. I love that album. I still listen to it quite regularly. I think it's an amazing record. Great songwriting on it. Rush Hour is definitely the best single she ever released. Inside a Dream is great.
Oh, yeah.
The End of Love is so great. But my favorite song, and it kind of has this faux industrial sort of feel to it, and it kind of reminds me a little bit of Donna Summer's I Feel Love, where it's got this really frenetic track over sort of like a really clean and angelic vocal, sort of minimalist, and that's Song of the Factory. God, I love that song so much. That whole album is still on my top. I just love it.
Yeah, the only other thing I've got for April is the very first record by the Primitives called Lovely. Again, another great voice, sort of that like British sort of like fuzz pop thing going on. You know, it's kind of like the Wall of Sound meets the Jesus and Mary chain, but kind of prettier. But it's really good. Like Crash is still fantastic. Spacehead's great. It's a really, really solid debut record.
I think I have one of my favorite records of all time in April, and that is Iron Maiden with Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, which to me was the culmination of what was effectively the second phase of Iron Maiden. Right? They did the first 2 albums with Paul Di'Anno, and then the second phase begins with The Number of the Beast, and runs really through to when Bruce leaves after Fear of the Dark. But for me, this is the real high point. It's such an interesting album. It's their foray into progressive metal. It starts off with that wonderful acoustic guitar on Moonchild, and then from there it's just track after track of fantastic progressive metal. And I think The Clairvoyant is probably my favorite Iron Maiden track of all time.
I wouldn't say it's my favorite ever, but it is probably the strongest track on that record. It's so great.
It's just such an insanely strong record. Yeah. And when they realized Operation Mindcrime came out the same year, apparently they kind of looked at each other and went, we've just put out our best album, but shit, these guys have done a better job than us. But we'll get back to that in, I think it's May. We'll get around to Queensryche.
But I did want to mention Boogie Down Productions, BDP, because by all means necessary. This is one of the I think this is pretty much like the first real politically conscious hip hop albums. It's like a landmark kind of album. KRS-One talking about like drugs, AIDS, violence, just so basically things that were just trying to that were threatening minority communities, and they were just really they were on top of all this, and I think it was just a really important debut album.
All right, Anthony, it is time for May.
Let's talk about Operation Mindcrime, because Queensryche came out with probably one of the most narrative progressive metal albums, or possibly even progressive rock albums of all time. Mm-hmm. It's insane how cohesive the story on that album is. You can follow it all the way through. And on top of that, it's the background of some really fantastic tracks. And you listen to that album and that's the sound of a band firing on all cylinders. And Jeff Tate's voice, holy shit, that's a good album.
I remember when that came out, and I was blown away by it too.
I don't think I heard it probably until about 2002, maybe 2003.
Mm-hmm.
Because I wasn't exactly going to find it at 6 months old. So, probably when I was about 15 was the first time I heard it. And even then, it stood up. To me, at a time when new metal was all the rage, and generally that genre had moved on.
Mm-hmm.
This still blew my mind away, and
Yeah, like
kind of
still
still does to
relevant
this day.
still, yeah.
I can still listen to the whole thing from start to finish today, and love every moment of it. It's such a good album that stands the test of time.
Yeah, agreed. And we've talked about Mindcrime before on previous episodes, but it is, just the high water mark of metal at this time, of concept album at this time. There's just nothing else that really compares to it. And, you talk about the cohesive storyline, the songs still work individually. Which meant that you had a couple of singles that did really well, particularly at rock radio, Eyes of a Stranger and I Don't Believe in Love, because you don't need, it adds to the storyline, but you don't have to have the storyline to understand the song, Yeah. It's just phenomenal.
Yeah.
A great piece of work.
And Alan, you say we've talked about them before. We've talked about that album before, and we will talk about it again.
We will.
I do have another metal album from May that I wanted to talk about, and that was Judas Priest with Ram It Down.
Oh, yes.
Now, this is an interesting one because Judas Priest's previous album, Turbo, is widely disliked by a lot of Judas Priest fans.
Yeah.
The one that comes after Ram It Down is Painkiller, which I went viral for with my little sniffer.
You're up to like 7.5K views, baby.
Insane. Fame at last. So Ram It Down is a weird one because it's kind of in the middle. You're starting to get that heavier edge you see with Painkiller. So it starts out with Ram It Down, which is, it's really kind of a frantic song.
Yeah.
But there are moments in that album that feel a lot more like the previous album, Turbo. And interestingly, they were originally meant to be one double album. So there was meant to be a more synthy side to what was going to be Twin Turbo and a heavier side. And a lot of the heavier side ended up on Ram It Down.
Yeah.
And it's a mixed album. It's a long way from being my favorite Priest album, but it does have one of my favorite Priest tracks on it, and that's Blood Red Skies.
Oh, yes. Yes. I would say that, and the title track is an absolute pile driver of a song, and I love it. It's like a musical jackhammer in your head. It is, man, it's incredible.
It only fades because the next album opens with Painkiller, which is even more of a musical jackhammer.
Exactly. And they've got their cover of Johnny Be Good too,
which is a solid cover. I was very surprised by that.
And they chose really odd things to cover, things that you wouldn't expect to find on a metal album. They did the old Fleetwood Mac song, and they did the
the Green Manalishi with the two-pronged crown.
Yes. And Diamonds and Rust.
The Joan Baez song, yeah.
And they make them work as Judas Priest songs, and that's just incredible.
Yep.
We had a very exciting debut album from Melissa Ethridge this year, and I say we because I'm talking about Island Records who released that, and I was working at Island at that point. Wow, I just remember working at the company that year and just how much build up and excitement and just we knew we had something, you know what I mean? It was very we were anticipating a great success with her, and really she totally delivered. That first album is fantastic. Bring Me Some Water, Like the Way I Do, just great songs, great songwriting. And if you saw her live, she had it all. She was such a she is such a powerhouse of a performer. And it was a really special signing by Chris Blackwell. He nailed that one. It was great.
Yeah, agreed. Well, I've got a Prince album.
Ooh.
Prince put out Love Sexy. which was the weirdest thing that he had done up to that point, where the album cover is him laying across a flower totally naked, and you're like, why? And he insisted that the album not be divided into tracks, to the point where when it's released on CD, it is one like 40-50 minute track. There's no separation between songs. So, because he wanted it to be heard and to be experienced as one complete work. He didn't want it to be thought of as individual songs. And it's just a bizarre album, even for him, but good. I think it's a great album. I think it's some really interesting songs on it. It's just, he just made his audience kind of work to get to it, And I don't think that was necessarily the best choice, but Prince always had in mind exactly what he wanted to do, whether it was good for marketing or good for the audience or not.
Mm-hmm. You also had another album that I think we both shared, which was Living Color.
Oh yeah, go ahead. Yeah, talk about that one.
Yeah.
That another amazing debut.
Right.
Vivid.
Yes.
And the massive success of Cult of Personality that year. I mean, that was just everywhere, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Great hard rockin', awesome band. I remember seeing them at CB's actually, I believe. And they, again, another powerhouse kind of album, just a great debut.
Yeah, absolutely. It was such a good album, and it mixed so many different genres. And we were talking about MTV in last week's episode, and we were talking about the whole thing about MTV not necessarily embracing black music. Living Color came along, and it was like they just salivated over it, because it was like, look, here's a hard rock album. We can still be a rock and roll station, and we can say we play black artists.
Yeah.
So, they just delivered
it was everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. It really was.
It was everywhere, but also that opening riff is like still, it's still great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's really the only song that, I think once the novelty wore off, they never really matched that success with any subsequent album or even either other releases, because there's some great stuff on this album. Glamour Boys is fantastic. Open Letter to a Landlord is another one of those tracks from 1988.
That thing is amazing.
Exactly. Another one from 1988 that talks about social issues, and it's just in a different package, but it's so good. So good.
Yeah. This is another hip hop album, Run DMC's Tougher Than Leather, which is their fourth album. And this is just sort of showing how, the different kind of within the genre, but the different styles that were out. I mean, you're talking about like BDP earlier in April, and then this comes out, and it's just sort of, they do talk about political stuff. They do talk about things that are affecting their communities, but they've gotten more element of fun, I feel like, to them. So Run's House, Mary Mary.
Oh yeah.
They just have a more just sort of a more upbeat kind of style. I love Run DMC. I think they consistently put out good music.
And Mary Mary built around the old Monkees hit.
Yeah.
Mary Mary, why you bugging? Oh man, I love it so much.
I know, and they had this was a really good record.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I got a couple of hard rock ones that I want to throw out really quickly. Yeah. Cinderella, Long Cold Winter, which was a kind of a departure from their sound from their first album. It's they're kind of in that hair metal scene, but I always felt like they really weren't, because they were much more blues rock. They were much more, like a modern Rolling Stones than anything else. And Long Cold Winter is a really good album, and I think it's a better album than their first one. But I think clearly bigger than that, was the second album that Van Halen released with Sammy Hagar at the microphone, and that is OU812. Which I absolutely love. Mine All Mine, the opening track, is amazing. When It's Love was the big single. There was actually a couple of big singles, because Finish What You Started also did extremely well at radio. But AFU, Naturally Wired, is phenomenal. everything about this album I absolutely love. I think it's the best Van Hagar album that they ever did. Such a great record.
I don't know. I mean, I did like a few of their songs, especially what is it? Why Can't It Be Love? Is that right?
Why Can't This Be Love?
This Be Love. Thank you. I did like that song a lot, but I could never get with the Hagar. I'm sorry. I really am.
That's okay. You don't have to. Our friendship is intact. No, I love Van Hagar. I was all in on that stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Shout out to our friend Ricky Bird from Joan Jett and the Blackhearts Band, because they had a Up Your Alley came out on May 23rd, and it wasn't a huge hit, I don't think, for them, but it had some really fun, good songs on it, like I Hate Myself for Loving You. And so shout out to Joan Jett.
One of my other previous bands used to play that song. That is a fun song to play. And if you put it early in your set and your first couple of songs didn't get the attention that you wanted them to, that song gets people on the floor listening, singing along, and clapping. It's a total crowd winner.
Yeah.
Soul Forge Podcast. It's a geeky look at love, life, fandom, mental health, pop culture, and so much more. If you're into learning about yourself and the universe, Soul Forge is your podcast. Each week, we have a surprising new topic, from stupid things we do for love to product reviews, and there's almost always a fun guest host. Like and subscribe to Soul Forge Podcast today.
All right, well, that wraps up the first half of our discussion of the albums of 1988. And if you want to listen to what we're talking about, go check out our Spotify playlist, where we cover every album that we talked about in this episode, one song per album, in the order in which we talked about it. And we'll be back next week with the second half of our discussion of the music of 1988. So don't miss that. Until then, Stephanie, why don't you kick us off with where people can find you?
You can find me on Facebook at Stephanie Seymour Music. You can find me on Instagram at there_r_birds. And I have a website, therearebirds.com. And you can find me on Bandcamp under my name, Stephanie Seymour. And of course, on all these streaming platforms like Spotify and stuff like that.
All right, Anthony.
You can also find me on the Watchers in the Fourth Dimension podcast, watching our way through all of Doctor Who from 1963 until now. We are on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and all of those other places wherever you like to get your podcasts. And you can also follow us on social media at Watchers4D on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, or X, or whatever the fuck it's called this week.
Right.
And you can also find me personally on Instagram at Englishman in ATL.
Rob, how about you?
So you can find me on Facebook or the Twitter X planetary mess that is. Also on Post under my name. And you can find me on the radio on Wednesday nights on KDHX 88.1 FM in St. Louis. Streaming at kdhx.org. So you can listen to that on the archive stream whenever you want. It's there for you to listen to whenever. Also, I host a show on Louder Than More Radio on Monday nights from 6 to 8 Greenwich Mean Time. And then that's 1 to 3 Eastern, 12 to 2 Central. It's called Antics. You can listen to that there. And I'm also on the Weekend Justice podcast, friendlycoffee.com.
All right. And I've got a website that catches all of my nonsense in one place, and that is Cosmic Creative. KOZMIC creative.com. You can find my books. You can find my podcast. So we will be back soon. Hope you'll stick around with us. Until then, take care. Keep rocking on. And we'll see you soon.
This has been a broadcast of the ESO Network. Be part of the crew and help support our shows by donating to our ESO Patreon or by shopping for the TeePublic store, which can all be found at www.esonetwork.com. The ESO Network, your station for all things geek.